Okay, and I take the sudden silence to mean the kind of reverence that Alison Bechdel kind of commands among her audience. So I'm Janice Knight, and I'm the chair of creative writing, and I want to welcome you to this terrific event. There's going to be a reception afterwards, and I also want to tell you that next week we will have, we're very fortunate to have a talk by another graphic novelist, Paul Hornschmeyer, who will also be teaching a course next quarter for us. So please, that's just been newly added, so please look on our webpage to find that. I want to say how grateful I am to be here today. I'm a great fan of Alison's, and obviously so are you. But before I turn to Dan Rayburn, who's going to introduce Alison, I want to tell you about another person of whom I'm really a great fan, and that is Jonathan Dedmon, who has so generously created the fund to support visiting writers like Alison. In 2007, I think it was, Jonathan, who is a member of our Humanities Visiting Committee, created the Claire and Emmett Dedmon Visiting Writers Program to honor his parents. The Dedmon Fund annually supports a distinguished visiting writer who is interested in exploring interdisciplinary aspects of the art, whose work moves across various genres, or whose work engages in innovative syntheses of more conventional genres. The university has long had a tradition of innovation in the literary arts, and the Dedmon Fund allows us to continue that tradition. Past Dedmon writers have included Michael Henry Heim, Richard Bausch, and Elliot Weinberger, and of course this year, Alison in the graphic novel. I'd also like to add just a couple of words about Jonathan himself. Last year, I discovered that before entering his current career in media and public relations, he worked 10 years himself as a journalist in Washington, D.C., and before that was a reporter not first, actually, for the Denver Post, but for the very venerable Rocky Mountain News. And I've also recently come to know him as a superior literary critic in a reading group on Melville's Moby Dick that we share. The creative writing program is immensely grateful for his support of our enterprise. So I'd like to ask you to please join me in honoring the memory of Claire and Emmett Dedmon, and in thanking their son for his generous. Over now to another venerable creative writing member, the Honorable Dan Rayburn, without whom we could not exist.
Okay, good crowd. Comic books. We're gathered here today to talk about something that nobody knows what to call. Comic books, graphic novels, now graphic memoir, which is a terrible term. Graphic memoir, you expect there's going to be an axe murder, full penetration or something. Our own Ivan Brunetti, graphic novelist, cartoonist, went to school here as an undergraduate, taught comics here for a number of years until he was stolen by Columbia College recently. Did the cover for this week's New Yorker, one of the 4 covers. I'm telling an anecdote about him because it reflects on Alison's work indirectly. He, like all cartoonists, has a hard time getting his work filed properly at Borders and Barnes & Noble and Amazon and whatnot. No matter how literary or serious or ambitious your work is, if you're a cartoonist, your work always gets filed with books about the movie Star Wars, or with Dungeons and Dragons modules in the graphic novels section of your friendly mega superstore, which nobody ever visits. So I decided, what am I going to do about this? And finally took a pen, and he was designing the cover for his book Haw, and he wrote in tiny letters in the back, "File under queer studies." Because he said, that's the only way I'm ever going to reach a normal audience. They're a queer medium, comics. They're words and pictures at once, but They're words and pictures that work simultaneously and in harmony, but also in counterpoint, kind of both at the same, they're both words and pictures, and yet they're like a third thing at the same time, something that's really easy to understand, right? We all grew up reading comics. But they're really hard to explain. They're even harder to draw. They're really hard to put a finger on and pin down. So maybe they're a trans medium as opposed to a queer medium. But they're just narrative. They're storytelling. Adrienne Rich, the poet and essayist, wrote a letter to our guest, Alison Bechdel. And in it, she said, in this letter, which I gather is one of Alison's most treasured possessions, she said, "I've always admired the way your work tries to explode dyke essentialism and explore our common humanity." I guess that's what I'm going to talk about very briefly. I chose that anecdote because I guess I want to talk a little bit about what Alison's work means to me. In case you don't know, Alison, for almost 30 years, 27 years, has done a comic strip called Dykes to Watch Out For, which has got to be one of the longest running soap operas in American culture. I mean, 27 years is an amazing body of work. I first encountered it at Women and Children First bookstore here in Chicago when I moved here almost 20 years ago. I was a small town kid. I had a goatee, but I was still a boy. I'd had a mullet recently, but I'd cut it off. But sort of the ghost of my mullet followed me around. And I walk into my friendly neighborhood feminist bookstore. And I'll admit I was a little nervous, you know. Straight guy, I walk in, and there's this book, Hot Throbbing Dykes to Watch Out For. A collection of Alison's cartoons. And I, being the limited man that I was, I gravitated toward it, you know. And it was not at all what I thought it was going to be. As Adrienne Rich put it, she really exploded a lot of things. It kind of blew my mind. I felt the same way I did the first time I read Robert Crumb's comics as a boy. I don't even know how to describe Dykes to Watch Out For. It's a soap opera, but it's also a New York Times op-ed, a really smart New York Times op-ed, ferociously smart discourse. It's the story of how people fall in love, fall out of love, and now have kids, move to the suburbs. It was a totally alien world, and yet within that alien world, I saw my world. And because my world was in that world, it sort of enlarged my world in that sort of magical transubstantive way that reading does. And any comic strip is going to mean a million different things to a million different people, especially one that's been running for 30 years. But what it meant to me was, when I moved to Chicago, the guy who went and read Dykes to Watch Out For was, as I said, still a boy. And now I'm not. And that comic strip is actually part of the reason. It fundamentally changed me and changed my world. I'm a more urbane, open-minded adult than I was when I was that limited small-town guy. So anyway, the joke is that reading Dykes to Watch Out For actually made a man out of me. So, speaking of men, Fun Home. All right, this is Alison's other big project. It won every literary award you can win, almost. My favorite was Book of the Year. Not Comic Book of the Year, not Graphic Memoir of the Year, just Book of the Year, period, in 2006. It's a book about her dad. I don't want to give away the story because I think she's going to talk about it, and if you haven't read it, I don't want to ruin it. Her dad was a closeted gay man. So closeted that he was probably even closeted to himself. And as a result, he kind of lived this lie, you know? So much so that it was sort of the death of him. And that even the death of him was kind of a lie, as you'll find out when you read the book. It was a fictional death. Everything about his life was artifice and fiction. And yet Alison managed to write this beautiful book about him because she used the one conduit into his life, which was the books he gave her to read. Joyce, Proust, Colette, Fitzgerald. Everything in his life was fiction, but you could discern the truth about his life through the fiction he gave her. It's an amazing book. I think we're going to see a lot of examples from it. If we're lucky, we'll see some examples from the book she's working on right now. Yesterday, when she was hanging out with our students for a few hours, one of the things she said that struck me was she said, you know, the book was about my dad, but it was really a book about reading. Now I'm writing a book about my mom. It's really a book about writing. I've long maintained that reading and writing are the double helix of a writer's DNA. And it's almost literally true in this case. So, anyway, please welcome one of our very best writers, Alison Bechdel.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for that really, quite beautiful introduction. I just want to sit there and listen to you keep talking. Thank you very much to the creative writing department for bringing me here. I feel very fancy. I wonder if we can turn the lights down a little bit. Does anybody know how to do that? Just for a more sort of... Can people hear me okay in the back of the room? Yes. Don't you think it's more pleasant to watch in the dark? All right.
Is that enough?
Yeah, that's okay. That'll help. Is anyone scared? You all okay? Okay. That was just a really interesting, it was a flattering introduction, but it was also very interesting. You brought up a lot of really interesting things. I want to start off by talking about this old saying that cartooning is a field for people who are mediocre artists and mediocre writers. And I would say that in my case, those things are really pretty much true. This is one of several rejection letters I received from graduate art programs in my youth. And this, interestingly, is a rejection letter from a literary journal about a year later from Adrienne Rich. Interesting that you mentioned her. It was actually a very sweet rejection letter, but a rejection letter nonetheless. What this maxim about mediocre artists and mediocre writers fails to take into account is the fact that writing and drawing together, telling stories with pictures, is a third thing, its whole own form that a person can be good at without necessarily being good at the individual parts. And my art by itself and my writing by itself at this time of my life really deserved those rejection letters. But then I started putting the things together. I love words and pictures together in a mystical way that I can't even explain, but I'm going to try to explain it a little bit today. The caption down there reads, "Will Kendrick still think I'm just an alarmist?" This is a Charles Addams cartoon. And Addams was my earliest, biggest cartoon influence. My parents had one of his books, and I would read it all the time. Well, I wouldn't read it. I would look at it before I knew how to read. I would look at these weird pictures without, I didn't understand what was happening in them. And eventually I learned to read, and I still couldn't understand what was happening in them. This one says, "We won't be late, Miss Weems. Get the children to bed around 8 and keep your back to the wall at all times." Like, what the hell did that mean? These baffled me, but at the same time, there was something deeply familiar about them. Because I grew up in an old, antique-filled house that looked very much like the world Addams was drawing. This is a panel from Fun Home. So I found his cartoons both familiar and enigmatic at the same time. And I also grew up in a house, as Dan said, filled with secrets and where appearances were extremely important. So the way that I didn't get Addams's cartoons reminded me of the way I didn't get what was going on around me in my household, in this family where there was a real disjuncture between appearance and reality. "Are you unhappy, darling?" Oh yes, yes, completely. See, check out the mantle. So it was somehow both tantalizing and soothing to see that disjuncture reflected back to me, this slippage between the words and the picture, between what Adams was saying and what you were seeing. And I very much wanted things to match up. I wanted people to tell the truth about what was going on. But what I found out as I went along through life was that nothing matches up, that this slippage is everywhere. Even when you try very hard to tell the truth, you can't, because language itself has this slippery relationship to reality. In my diary when I was 10, this is more stuff from Fun Home, I started doubting whether the things I was writing were really absolutely demonstrably true. And I would qualify sentences I was worried about with these tiny little I thinks that I would write at the end. And then I started kind of perseverating over them, like writing it once wasn't enough, so I'd write it over and over until there were blots like this. But that got very time consuming, so I turned it into just this sort of asterisk symbol that I then started putting over all names and proper nouns. And it became like this protective device. You know, I mean, if doing it once was good, then doing it multiple times was even better. And then I realized, oh, I could put it over a whole entry and protect everything I had written. And if doing that once was okay, then doing that multiple times would be even better. Until ultimately I was almost obliterating everything I had written. And I think this has something to do with why I became a cartoonist. Does that look weirdly stretched out? I forgot to check if the
It's a hearse, right?
Yeah, no, it's good. It's okay. So I sensed on some level that if language was unreliable and appearances were deceiving, then maybe somehow by triangulating between the two things, you could manage to get a little closer to the truth. Twyla is appalled to learn that Irene is a morning person. Telling the truth remained somewhat of a compulsion for me as I grew up. Our big family secret was that my dad was gay, so when I figured out that I was a lesbian, I wanted to be very open and upfront about it. And somewhat to my mother's distress, I started drawing this comic strip called Dykes to Watch Out For soon after I got out of college. Another thing that I liked about working with words and pictures together was the fact that cartoons were this lowbrow, accessible, populist medium that was not really going to get scrutinized or critiqued the way fine art or literary writing would. And after all those rejection letters, I was very fragile as a young artist. But cartoons were like this judgment-free zone, a way to express myself while simultaneously guaranteeing a certain measure of obscurity. And choosing the obscure path of comics wasn't quite enough, so I chose as my subject matter something even further from the limelight, the domestic habits of politically committed lesbian feminists. So the comic strip evolved into a soap opera, as Dan said, with regular characters, and I drew it for many years. I actually stopped doing it a year ago. I can't tell if I've really stopped or if I'm on hiatus, but I have had to suspend it to do other stuff, which was a very difficult decision to make. Still kind of adjusting to that. One of my preoccupations in the comic strip was always the tension between being an outsider and being a citizen. I always liked being an outsider. I felt like it gave me a certain objectivity about the world that I wouldn't have if I were inside the system, inside the sphere of normalcy. Yet, of course, I yearned on some deep level to be normal, or rather for my queerness to be seen as normal. So the strip became a way for me to normalize my own difference. It was never about defending or explaining homosexuality, but just making it a ground assumption. It was just there. And I always hoped it would win over a broader audience, but I didn't want to have to. I didn't want to have to. Why do I do this? I know. I hoped it would win over a broader audience, but I always refused to water it down. So it was part soap opera, but also part editorial cartoon. Dan, you basically gave my whole talk in your introduction. I would weave current events into the story of the characters' lives. Because I always find the news very overwhelming and baffling. So I would use the strip as a way to sort of make order out of all that chaos, and of the chaos of current events by recasting things in these more familiar everyday terms. Like here's my characters at the mall. This was, the mall is like this little microcosm of the country at that moment in time. I came of age learning that the personal is political and that our intimate lives have political implications. But I also believe that that goes the other way, that our political lives have an intimate aspect, and that the relationship between countries and between citizens and their governments and between politicians and voters, that all of those things are just interpersonal relationships writ large, with basically the same dynamics as a marriage or a family. Often a rather dysfunctional one, but one whose basic workings we all recognize. Which brings me to my dysfunctional family memoir. In a way, I feel like Fun Home carries on the mission of Dykes to Watch Out For. It's an intensely personal story, but also a story about the way our most intimate selves can't escape their political contexts. It's about my father's suicide, but it's also about the opposite of suicide, about creativity and how I learned to be an artist from my dad. I had the somewhat unusual experience of being raised by parents who loved music and books and art, and who actually wanted me to become an artist or a writer. And that might sound really great, but it's kind of a double-edged sword, because you still have to rebel against it. God, that was so traumatic. But the method of rebellion that I came up with was, instead of becoming an artist or a writer like they wanted me to, I became both at once. And sometimes I think I became a cartoonist because it was the only creative turf my parents had no interest in. But also, like I said earlier, the combination of words and pictures seemed to solve a problem for me. And as this section of the story progresses here, with the coloring book, I talk about how my favorite part of the Wind in the Willows coloring book that my dad has commandeered here is the map. This is actually my redrawing of the map. But as a child, I just found this profoundly mystical. I would look at this forever. In the same way I would look at the Charles Addams cartoons. And I think there's a similar thing going on. The cool thing about this map was that it was a map with a symbolic overlay of labels and the compass rose in the corner. But if you really looked up close, it was an almost animated depiction of reality. As you could see Mr. Toad careening along there in his motor car. And it was this bridging of symbol and reality of the label Iron Bridge and the Iron Bridge itself. That was so exciting to me. That slippage between signifier and signified that was so troubling to me in my diary seemed somehow to come to rest here, or at least pause enough to take stock. And cartoons are like maps to me, in the way they distill the three-dimensional world into this layer of pictures and a layer of words that you can hold in your hands. I feel like Fun Home was kind of a map of a part of my life. In fact, I think of my obsessive-compulsive 5th grade diary as in some ways, a very early draft of Fun Home. It was a similar attempt to pin down something accurate about my experience. And even now, my creative process entails a lot of self-obliteration and obsessiveness. I'm going to show you a little bit now about how I work, some stuff about my process. Because people always ask me, what comes first, the writing or the pictures? And I always feel sort of like a cheater as a cartoonist, because I do write the words. I generally write the words first. But it's not exactly just writing. Like writing in a word processing program, I can't write like that. I write in a drawing program, in Adobe Illustrator. So I have a two-dimensional page that I'm working with, not just a line of text on a screen. And I can move things around, draw panels, reshape panels, write words, edit words, reshape the shape of the words. It's a very flexible and visual way to write. And I'm thinking of images I'm going to be placing here as I write. I'm showing you just not a full page, but a part of a page. I'm going to show you its progression from just the writing all through the final process. When I get it written, I print it out just on my, on typing paper and start sketching. And then I keep refining the sketches in multiple layers with, tracing paper overlays, getting more and more detail into them. I love how the pipes knock at this place. It's become very comforting. The first night I was here, it's like I totally thought the Quadrangle Club was haunted. But now it's very soothing. Oh no, don't tell me it is. I don't want to know that. So as I was refining the drawings, I was doing that by looking at all these photo sources. This is a scene. The scene I'm drawing happens in 1976 in Greenwich Village. And it was a point when I was 15 years old, and I all of a sudden noticed gay men for the first time. And we're up on this roof watching fireworks, and I noticed this bunch of gay men hanging out on the roof. So I did a lot of visual research on what were gay men wearing, how was their hair in 1976. Like those socks, those tube socks. Who would have remembered that? In my crazy web research, I even was able to locate the exact rooftop we were on, because the place turned into a condo, and the address was online. This would have been a very, very different book if I didn't have access to Google image search. Because I can find all these references, I have to draw them. This is from a book. I knew I had this book with skyline pictures, so I stole some of those buildings in the background for my drawing. I Googled fireworks. That probably took me 2 hours. Fireworks are like, who knows how they look? They're hard to draw. Water towers. I even Googled people on a roof. I'm sort of like a method cartoonist. I don't know, I didn't use anything really visually from this, but just the feeling of people on a roof on a summer night was helpful. I also have a huge bunch of family photographs. This is my father, just your average all-American dad at home. But this is my dad around the time that this story happened. That's me on the right around the time that this story happened. There's that long mountain. See that mountain? Bald Eagle Mountain. God, I love that mountain. And now I do this crazy thing. Now, as I'm writing about my life, of like posing. I do all these compulsive photo references of myself in the poses of the characters. Even simple things like a person standing there. I've gotten totally dependent on the camera for the simplest things. People coming out of doorways is always tricky, though. I need a picture for that. So all of this research goes into, there's the old sketch. It turns from that to this with all of the, all that research I've done. So I get a very tidy, precise pencil sketch, which I then ink. Inking is the fun part. I love inking. At this point, like, once you have the pencil done, 95% of the work is complete, and you get to just do this fun part. And you can make mistakes, like, see this? I fucked that all up, but I fixed it in Photoshop. I cheat all the time. Or this, I just left that there and deleted it in Photoshop. And I totally filled in the black area in Photoshop. I don't know. I don't really think about the page itself as a piece of art. I'm thinking more toward the ultimate printed product, which is sort of sad because I don't really have pretty pieces of art to sell anyone. I should work on that. And then I would shade the stuff on a separate layer of watercolor paper, which I would also scan into Photoshop, and then I'd combine them. But it wasn't until I'd done both of these things separately that I would have this wonderful moment of, oh, that's how it's going to look. I didn't really know until I got it done. I also cheated by doing my text digitally. That's not hand lettering. My hand lettering is not nearly that neat. And then at the printer's end, they tinted that shading layer, so it came out green. Here's me doing some of my crazy posing as my dad for this. I don't always dress up. That was just an unusual situation. Mostly I'm just, whatever I have on, I just run out and take a picture. Also, I don't know, I did use Polaroids before I had a digital camera, but that was always hard. I didn't have a remote, so I'd have to, get friends to pose for me, and each picture cost $1. It was crazy. So my work has evolved very much in sync with the technological possibilities. Sometimes to my downfall. Sometimes I think I just spend way too much time on this craziness. But in a way, it also saves time. If I can take 30 seconds to do a photo reference that will help me get a better, more accurate drawing, that's good. I'm just showing some of the crazy, I keep saying crazy, I shouldn't say that. Just some of my more obsessive little rabbit holes I went into while working on Fun Home. I wanted to quote a Charles Addams cartoon, so of course I couldn't just copy his work into my piece. So I redrew it myself, which took a long time. That's mine on the right, his on the left. I had to make up a fake New Yorker cartoon that looked, I wanted it to, have the feel of a New Yorker cartoon, but it couldn't look like any actual particular New Yorker cartoon. It was just for this one little thought balloon. I love text. I incorporated a lot of actual text from books as images in Fun Home. This is a real map, which I used to create my own map in the book. Map making, as I realized, is an amazing and very complicated art form. Isn't that cool? See, look, how did they do that? It took me forever to make those little crosshatches, then do that tonal shading, arrange all the words so they match the places. That took forever. One weekend I spent recreating the William Morris wallpaper pattern we had in our living room. I did a lot of copying of photographs in Fun Home. This was, actually the whole book kind of grew out of this picture, which I discovered, well, you'll find out because I'm going to read that part of the book. This is a photo of my dad. Isn't that wild? It was like in, I don't know, his fraternity scrapbook. Like, I don't know, is this some kind of prank or I don't know what. But I used that. I began each of my chapters with a copied photo, a snapshot from our family archives. I spent a lot of time on these pictures trying to, it's hard to draw a photograph because a photograph, of course, is a tonal image, and this is lines, and it was a fun drawing challenge to try and recreate some of that feeling, which, I didn't ever do it nearly well enough. So that's how I do what I do. I'm afraid I don't have stuff of my current project to show because I shouldn't talk about that in public. I can only talk about it in small classes of creative writing students. But I'm going to read a section of Fun Home to you now, okay? I'll just sort of set the stage a little bit. In the first chapter of the book, I introduced my father. He was this part-time mortician, amateur decorator, historical preservationist, high school English teacher who had sex with his students and very likely killed himself. He died by being hit by a truck. In the second chapter of the book, I talk about how weird it was to grow up around a funeral home and how surreal to experience my own father's funeral there. In the third chapter, I explain the weird timing of my own coming out to my family just a few months before my dad died, and how I've always felt kind of responsible for his death in an indirect kind of way. And in the fourth chapter, the Proust chapter, I delve more deeply into my relationship with my dad, focusing on this aspect of our shared homosexuality. I never know how to say that. It sounds like I had a homosexual relationship with my dad. How would you say that? Our mutual homosexuality? That sounds even worse. I don't know. All right. Chapter 4, In the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower. I have suggested that my father killed himself, but it's just as accurate to say that he died gardening. He'd been clearing brush from the yard of an old farmhouse he was planning to restore, and had just crossed Route 150 to toss an armload over the bank. The truck driver described my father as jumping backward into the road as if he saw a snake. And who knows? Perhaps he did. Of all his domestic inclinations, my father's decided bent for gardening was the most redolent to me of that other, more deeply disturbing bent. What kind of man but a sissy could possibly love flowers this ardently? Our home was an efflorescence of bulbs, buds, and blooms, flowers wild and cultivated, native and imported, flowering vines and trees. Silk flowers, glass flowers, needlepoint flowers, flower paintings, and where any of these failed to materialize, floral patterns. At Easter, Dad would paint goose eggs with twining tea roses. During the ensuing hunt, we would be sure to find a yellow egg in a thatch of daffodils, a lavender egg passing itself off as a crocus, and nestled in the crabapple tree, a pink egg, the precise shade of the blossoms that would soon burst forth there. Our games of baseball, already lethargic affairs, would grind to a halt as soon as the ball rolled near a perennial border. There, my father would become lost to us in a reverie of weeding. At the fun home, this is what we call the family funeral home, that's where the title of the book comes from. At the fun home, Dad would take a break from his grisly chores to tweak the stiff arrangements delivered by the florist. Ugly as these were, their quick, damp scent masked the odor of formaldehyde. If my father had a favorite flower, it was the lilac, a tragic botanical specimen, invariably beginning to fade even before reaching its peak. We stopped for a moment by the fence. Lilac time was nearly over. Some of the trees still thrust aloft in tall purple chandeliers, their tiny balls of blossom. But in many places among their foliage, where only a week before they had still been breaking in waves of fragrant foam, these were now spent and shriveled and discolored, a hollow scum, dry and scentless. That's how Proust describes the lilacs bordering Swann's Way in remembrance of things past. My father had begun reading this the year before he died. After the lilac passage, Proust describes Swann's garden in a feat of both literary and horticultural virtuosity that climaxes in the narrator's rapturous communion with the pink blossoms of the hawthorn hedge. Through the hedge, Proust's narrator could see even deeper into Swann's garden. There, surrounded by jasmine, verbena, and pansies, sat a little girl. The young narrator, failing to distinguish this girl from the general floral fecundity, instantly fell in love with her. If there was ever a bigger pansy than my father, it was Marcel Proust. Proust would have intense emotional friendships with fashionable women, but it was often young, straight men with whom he fell in love. He would also fictionalize real people in his life by transposing their gender. The narrator's lover, Albertine, for example, is often read as a portrait of Proust's beloved chauffeur/secretary, Alfred. My father could not afford a chauffeur/secretary, but he did spring for the occasional yard work assistant/babysitter. He would cultivate these young men like orchids. I admired their masculine charms myself. Indeed, I had become a connoisseur of masculinity at an early age. I sensed a chink in my family's armor, an undefended gap in the circle of our wagons, which cried out, it seemed to me, for some plain two-fisted sinew. I measured my father against the grimy deer hunters at the gas station uptown with their yellow work boots and shorn sheep haircuts. And where he fell short, I stepped in. I counted as an indication of my success the nickname bestowed on me by my older cousins. No one needed to explain what it meant. It was self-descriptive, cropped, curt, percussive, practically onomatopoeic, at any rate the opposite of Sissy. And despite the tyrannical power with which he held sway, it was clear to me that my father was a big sissy. Ernst refers to his explicitly homosexual characters as inverts. I've always been fond of this antiquated clinical term. It's imprecise and insufficient, defining the homosexual as a person whose gender expression is at odds with his or her sex. But in the admittedly limited sample comprising my father and me, perhaps it is sufficient. Not only were we inverts, we were inversions of one another. While I was trying to compensate for something unmanly in him, he was attempting to express something feminine through me. It was a war of cross purposes, and so doomed to perpetual escalation. That was a bad night. Between us lay a slender, demilitarized zone, our shared reverence for masculine beauty. But I wanted the muscles and tweed, like my father wanted the velvet and pearls, subjectively for myself. The objects of our desire were quite different. Shortly after Dad died, I was rooting through a box of family photos and came across one I had never seen. It's low contrast and out of focus, but the subject is clearly our yard work assistant / babysitter, Roy. It appears to have been taken on a vacation when I was 8, a trip on which Roy accompanied my father, my brothers, and me to the Jersey Shore, while my mother visited her old roommate in New York City. I remember the hotel room. My brothers and I had one adjoining it. The blurriness of the photo gives it an ethereal, painterly quality. Roy is gilded with morning seaside light. His hair is an aureole. In fact, the picture is beautiful. But would I be assessing its aesthetic merits so calmly if it were of a 17-year-old girl? Why am I not properly outraged? Perhaps I identify too well with my father's illicit awe. A trace of this seems caught in the photo, just as a trace of Roy has been caught on the light-sensitive paper. The picture was in an envelope labeled family in Dad's handwriting, along with other shots from the same trip. The borders of all the photos are printed August '69, but on the one of Roy, Dad has carefully blotted out the 69 and 2 small bullets on either side with a blue magic marker. It's a curiously ineffectual attempt at censorship. Why cross out the year and not the month? Why, for that matter, leave the photo in the envelope at all? In an act of prestidigitation typical of the way my father juggled his public appearance and private reality, the evidence is simultaneously hidden and revealed. And that's the end of that. Could someone, whoever turned the lights off, turn them back on? That would be great. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody wants to ask any questions. Yes?
I was wondering if you could talk about the parallel, but obviously not parallel experiences of inhabiting the characters of Dr. Watch Out For, whom obviously you got to know very well over, 20-some years, and then the inhabiting the characters who were your family, but still in some ways belonged to you because you were creating this literary something.
All of my characters are me in this weird way, even my family members. And obviously, I'm like doing this strange, elaborate posing method, impersonating members of my family, which I also did for the comic strip, impersonating the characters there. But I kind of started it with Fun Home, and it mutated into my Dykes Watch Out For work. Sometimes I feel like, did you ever see that movie Being John Malkovich? I feel like I'm like John Malkovich going through his own portal where just like all I can write about is myself, all I see is myself, all the characters are me. It's really sad. But
know, I mean, that's, in a way, that's what anyone does. You have to have some point of identification, I think, to write about someone. Otherwise, how could you even begin? That's my answer to that question. One down. Yes.
What's the reaction of your family? I always think my memoir has to happen after my parents die. They can't be alive for it. But what about the rest of your family? What's the reaction?
I never hear that question. It's a very good question. This is the big question that's inevitably someone asks very early on. What does my family think of all this? This was, at the time, this was a very difficult book to write. I had to show it to my mother and my brothers. I had to deal with my mother's anxiety and anger and different feelings that came up. But also, well, it was a hard thing. But what I'm saying is, I am now working on a memoir that's about my mother, who was alive. Writing the memoir about my father, who was dead, it was nothing, piece of cake, you know? Even though it was very hard at the time, I see now, like, what was my problem? Anyone can do that. I don't know. I mean, it's a very tricky thing, and sometimes I feel like it's my particular family, my particular damage from my particular family that enables me to write memoir, or compels me to write memoir about them, perhaps with some sort of not even veiled aggression. But that's what I have to do. I'm having this really interesting experience with my mother. She knows I'm writing a book about her now. She's not happy about it. But my mom is really remarkable. And she's, she doesn't say don't do it. She says, do what you have to do. But she doesn't want to know about it. She doesn't want to talk to me about it. I think it makes her feel like it's not really about her if she stays out of it. So I don't know, it does help if people are dead.
Yeah, Virginia Woolf didn't start writing until her parents.
I know.
Right? There's a lot of examples.
Yeah.
Wait until they're both gone.
Virginia Woolf is really interesting. Her mom died when she was, what, like 13?
Yeah.
And she said her mother just like inhabited her head constantly until she wrote To the Lighthouse. When she was what? How old was she then? 40? Something like that. But once she wrote that book, I can keep hoping that writing this memoir about my mother will have that same effect. Get her out of my head as a critical voice, But we'll see. We'll see how that works out.
So you're writing this book with therapy, or you're
No,
kind of reaching an audience?
I'm going to therapy, like therapy. I won't say that the book is not therapeutic. This is a complicated question. I think memoirists often get asked this question: is this cathartic for you? Is this therapeutic? And recently I was thinking, I've always gone to great lengths to say, no, it's not therapeutic. I go to therapy for that. I don't want to inflict my unprocessed emotional baggage on my readers. But on the other hand, of course it's therapeutic, of course it's cathartic, but it's like asking someone who just swam the English Channel if they had a good workout. It's beside the point. But yes, it was therapeutic, and I hope this book will be also cathartic in that way. Yes, in the back.
First of all, I'd like to say how incredibly proud I was that Fun Home was listed as Time Magazine's book of the year.
That was so awesome.
Graphic novel, but book, which was fantastic.
Yeah.
Because it is a book, absolutely, and deserves every single award that it's won. What I wanted to ask about was something I noticed after reading through the recent Essential Dykes to Watch Out For, after about the third or fifth time I'd read through it again, noticing that for the majority, the characters who seem to be the most challenging in terms of challenging characters' assumptions, readers' assumptions, the majority of them seem to be blonde. I mean, you've got Lois, Thea, Sydney, Cynthia. I'm probably forgetting. There's at least one other I'm forgetting. Harriet.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
Totally true. Well, I never I'll be able to put all these controversial views onto them. Huh, good one. Right here.
Yeah. What's it like having your work and through your work to extend yourself become something that is being written about and being studied? And, coming to rooms like this to talk about if that makes any sense.
Coming and talking feels different than being written about. They're like two separate things. I know this is kind of weird and exhibitionistic, but that's kind of cool. I don't mind it. It's fun. Being written about is very peculiar. Like there have been a number of academic articles written about Fun Home, most of which I can't even understand. But it's funny. I mean, I feel like it's wonderful. Like I'm so happy that people are that interested or finding things in it. But I have to kind of just separate from it. I mean, it's not really about me personally. I was just recently at American University. We did a colloquium on Fun Home, and I didn't go to the actual conversation, but I sneaked outside of one of the rooms, and I heard people talking about my mother and my father as characters in this book. It was just really totally mind-blowing. I forget what they were saying. I wish I knew because it was really fun. Anyhow. Yes.
And one of the most moving things in Fun Home, so many, I'll say like one, but your use of geography, your use of place. There's that one scene where you show Interstate 80, and the two ends, and it's covered by your little town. So close.
Yeah.
And also all the stuff about Lyndon and Willis with the map. And there's so much yearning in all of that geography in the book. It's just beautiful. I don't have a question.
I just have always loved maps. I remember discovering that you could get a topographical map of any square inch of the country when I was like 16, and I started sending away for maps of my house and maps of where I was going to go to college. And I've always had like maps of everything. Now, of course, I have my own GPS on my iPhone. Not quite the same. I'll make a nice paper map. Yes.
So in the chapter of the book, Ideal Husband, which is where your father makes the least appearance and your mother is more predominant, if I remember correctly. It's also, I think, the chapter where you talk about getting a period for the first time, and there's that scene in the house with the two doctor, I forget their last names.
The doctor's Brunetti.
And there's a picture on the wall of the husband's painting of his wife, and the kids running with their fake guns, and they're like, spread 'em, punks. And so I was just wondering, there's this huge kind of question of body and a woman's body in this chapter, and there's also the domination of like the presence of the mother rather than the father in this chapter. And I was wondering if there was some kind of deliberate attempt to orient sexual identity and that narrative of yourself with your father, and then more of a sort of directly physical kind of embodied understanding of self with your mother, or whether I just totally read that.
No, you totally read that in, but I like it. It's weird. I feel like, in a way, I'm like offering myself up for psychoanalysis, and I want to do it first. I want to get it right myself first. I want to analyze myself, but other people often have more accurate insights, which is a weird feeling. Like right now, I feel incredibly exposed. Why do I do this? It's interesting too, because now that I'm working on this book about my mother, and I'm exploring a lot of her acting roles. That summer that she played Lady Bracknell in The Importance of Being Earnest was so funny. Like I just, well, it's weird. You'll have to read my next book when I figure it all out. But, Yes, you in the back.
I think your words and art alike are very lovely and evocative. And one thing I was drawn to quite a bit was the specificity in your artwork. No table looks the same. No window looks the same. If someone's reading a book, they're reading a specific book with an author and a title. I just wondered, how do you go about choosing the details to put into your paintings?
That's a good question. I was talking about yesterday in a Korean writing class about how I have this executive function disorder in my brain, and all I can see are the details. Like if I were left to my own devices, I would draw. Like if I were drawing this room, I would draw every grain of wood in those panels. You know, if I'm drawing a bookshelf, I have to draw every title of the book. I have to draw the publisher's logo and the spine of the book. So much of drawing is knowing when to stop doing that. You know, to make it image legible and focus people's eyes where you want them to go. So I don't. It's not so much about what details I know to include as when do I stop including. And I don't know. I don't know if I'm that great at it. But I do always want to create images that takes you a while to read, that you can spend time in the pictures. You know, it's like it takes time you have to run each word through your head. I want you to look at all the areas of the drawing too, and not just flip over like, you know, some comics like manga, for example. I've never seen this, but people have told me about watching Japanese people reading on the subway, and they're just like turning pages like that. Like I don't want people to read them like that. Yes.
Secrets and things like work right under the table or out in the open.
Yeah.
Just because now I'm looking at those and thinking, maybe wow, that's why they didn't like the Einstein because of that.
Yeah. I never actually got to see the TV show. We didn't get that channel, but so I didn't see it until much later. I never saw it. I only saw the wonderful movies. Yes.
I really like the teacher nibs in Nice Boy Shop. How did you start doing that?
She's talking about these little tips of the nib I would give in my comic strip. I think I got that from Hatlo's. They'll do it. What's that cartoon? Hatlo's. They'll do it every time. They would always say a tip of the hat to somebody who sent in an idea for that cartoon that week. So I would give a tip of the nib of the penguin to people who helped me. Like I had all these consultants, like people I talked to about the various characters' jobs, or if I ever stole somebody's dialogue verbatim, I would give them a tip of the nib. That's all. That's what that's about. We're about done? You want to go to reception?
Well, I've been trying to figure out how I can ask this question. I'm not even sure what questions. I'm just struck. You know, there's a drawing of you, and there you are. And and you said when you were young, I was very struck because I had a similar kind of, I think, kind of anxiety about the truth of what is true, making it kind of provisional, or you found a visual way to make it provisional. And then the other moment we were talking, you said you liked the word iron bridge next to the bridge. And I wondered if the use of photographs, you said you use photographs because it can make drawing easier, but I was struck with the ways in which when you pose it coming out of the car and then it's your mother coming out of the car, there's this kind of parallel, it's like a reassurance about the real or something like that, or just, I don't even know what I'm asking, except that it just seems so interesting. It asks something of me to think about the relationship between the real and that drawing. Does that, I mean, it's not really a question, it's just the idea that the word would be there and the bridge would be there is so comforting.
Yeah, you know, often it takes like a lot of energy to get it up to finally start that posing process, which launches me into the drawing process. I
I feel like drawing, drawing is not like, I love to draw, but it's not, I feel like I'm probably a stronger writer than a drawer. I have no self-doubt about my drawing. And to fill a blank picture plane with a drawing, with a fictional, or with my past, with the scenes from my past, feels like this huge physical effort. And somehow it's like I have to really push into it, physically push through that plane, and it's enacting these things that the characters are doing that helps me to get there. I think that's sort of related to what you're talking about, but it's what I have, it's like probably some kind of magical thinking, but it's what I have to do to immerse myself in drawing.
Sort of like reassurance in some ways. I was just relating to my own feeling of what reassures me in relationship to the picture to reality.
You don't have to reassure you.
Thank you.
Try to reassure you. All right.